Okay, let's look at phonemes and allophones in a different way. Which of these three things are actually meaningfully different acts? So let's say that you're a foreigner in a new culture, or maybe even an alien from outer space, and you see three different things. You see someone laying yellow flowers on a grave. You see someone laying red flowers on a grave. And you see someone bringing yellow flowers to a party. So from a totally outsider perspective, from a scientific perspective, these are three different acts. There's something objectively different about each of these. And that would be from an etic perspective. All three are very different from each other. And I can't decide, or I can't make any strong decisions about, or well-informed decisions about which two of these three acts might be more related than which other two. That would be an emic perspective. In order to figure out which of these actions, which are very separate from each other, might be linked, might be grouped together into the same category by the people doing them, I would have to get an emic perspective. An emic perspective is an insider's perspective. It's maybe what you try to do via ethnography, where you try to become one of sort of the people you're living among. And it turns out that even though from an etic perspective, no matter who you are, all three of these different activities would be very different, the emic perspective is subjective. It can really change. For example, as an American, I might think of these three activities, laying yellow flowers on a grave and laying red flowers on a grave, are basically just different versions of the same basic activity, which is bringing flowers to a grave. And it's that action of bringing flowers to a grave, which is really a meaningful action. And for most Americans, it doesn't really matter what color of flowers you put on the grave. It's just going to be, I just bring flowers to the grave. So I would lump those two together as being just different versions of the same fundamental activity. Whereas bringing flowers to a party seems like a totally different kind of thing. The purpose for bringing the flowers is different. The reason for bringing the flowers, the result of bringing them, it's a very different kind of thing. So I would lump these two, bringing flowers to a grave, together, and then bringing flowers to a party would be very different. If I was a Lithuanian, however, I might group these up differently. Yellow flowers are symbolized with death in the Lithuanian culture. So bringing yellow flowers to a grave would be an appropriate act because it's an act sort of recognizing that death has occurred. Bringing red flowers to a grave would be completely inappropriate. Red being sort of a color of like love and passion, it would send a very strange signal to bring red flowers to a dead person, even if they were your dead partner. And bringing yellow flowers to a party would be a terrible move because you're sort of wishing that everyone at the party would die and you're hoping for their imminent death. So if I was taking the emic perspective of a Lithuanian, I might say bringing yellow flowers to a grave is one thing, and then these two, bringing red flowers to the grave or bringing yellow flowers to the party, are both very inappropriate acts or both rude acts. So they may have more in common with each other than with this one. Or I might think of it that the act of yellow flower bringing is a death sign. So it's yellow flower bringing is more different than red flower bringing than anything else. So maybe these two are grouped together as being different versions of the same thing, bringing a flower which symbolizes death, and this would be a totally other kind of thing, bringing a flower which symbolizes life and love. So you can see, like, thinking like an anthropologist, and anthropologists do often talk about etic perspectives and emic perspectives. What would a random outsider who knows nothing about the inner workings of a culture think versus what would someone who inhabits a culture, inhabits a worldview think? What are the decisions they would make about which two things are meaningfully the same or meaningfully different? So we can apply the same way of thinking to sounds. There's an alveolar lateral approximant, la la la, which the tongue is sort of there, and remember with a lateral approximant for all of these, there's going to be air flowing out around the side of the tongue, between the tongue and the teeth, and out the front. That's what makes it kind of this L-like sound, a lateral sound. There's a velarized version of this lateral approximant. This isn't quite exactly what's happening, but basically you're kind of in la position, but in the back, the back of your tongue is also going into a velar position here. La la la. So la la la, la la la, la la la. And there's even a palatalized lateral approximant where the top of your tongue is sort of hitting the hard palate here. La la la, 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 li li li, li li li, li li li. So from an outsider's perspective, from a scientific perspective, there's no denying that these are three totally different sounds. Different things are going on in the mouth, the spectrogram is going to be different. Anything that a microphone or a video camera might pick up will show us incontrovertible evidence that these are three totally different sounds. So ethically, they're different. That's kind of why we talk about phonetics. Phonetically, these are different sounds. But does that difference actually matter to anyone? Do I, as a speaker of random language X, actually care about the difference between these three sounds? And if you're an English speaker listening to this video so far, you're probably thinking, I never cared about the difference between these three sounds. That's because these may be ethically different, but they're probably not emically different for you. And whether they are emically different, whether the differences between these three different lateral approximants matter, is going to really depend on whose perspective you're inside of. As language learners, we're always moving from our old perspective into a new perspective, our old community into a new community, and as teachers, we're facilitating people to do that. So this change of perspective is an important part of what we do. So here again, I have these three different versions of the lateral approximant, la, la, and ya. In English, this word leak, it's normally pronounced leak with the alveolar one, but if I said the palatal one instead, leak, or the velarized one instead, leak, it would be the same word. I have a leak in my kitchen. I have a leak in my kitchen. It might be a funny pronunciation of the same word or a little unexpected. You might think, oh, this guy has an accent. But you would never think that I'm not saying the word leak. It definitely is the same word leak, which is water dripping from the ceiling. Same thing with the word keel. I would normally use that velarized one because it's at the end of a syllable in English, keel. But if I said keel or keel, the keel on my ship is broken. The keel on my ship is broken. You wouldn't be confused about what part of my ship was broken. I might have a different accent, but it doesn't change it to a different word. It's not a brand new word. They would be just different pronunciations of the same word. So the contrast between these three sounds in English, although they might be scientifically or objectively different, ethically different, from an emic perspective, these three are just variants of the same sound which we may call L sound. And I've probably never actually stopped to think about the difference between all three of these sounds before because I've never needed to as an English speaker. These differences aren't important. German is the same way. Although the actual patterns that a German use might be different, they would say Lob for praise, yet Lob, if I said Lobpreis instead of Lobpreis or Lobpreis, it wouldn't change the meaning of the word. It would be the same word. It would be maybe a strange pronunciation of the same word. You might think I'm a foreigner, I have an accent, but it definitely means the same thing. There's no way that what I'm saying could mean anything else besides praise. If I were to say the word Paul, which is the name, notice that whereas in English I do the velarized one at the end, in German I would do the alveolar one at the end. But if I did the English pronunciation, instead of saying German word Paul, I said Paul, like an American, it would still mean the same thing. They would know who I'm talking about. Or even if I said Paul, they would know who I'm talking about. It wouldn't change the meaning. It wouldn't be ever heard as a different word. So again, like an English speaker, a German speaker, these three versions of L would all be heard as really non-important variants of the same fundamental thing. They're all three different flavors of that same L sound which exists. It's just one category in the brain with these three different realizations. The picture changes though when we look at some other languages. If I don't inhabit the perspective of an English or of a German, but inhabit the perspective of a Russian, this could be a different story. So there's this word in Russian, ugol, which means corner or kind of edge sometimes. But if I pronounced it as ugol, which is probably what an American would do, instead of saying ugol, ugol, I would say ugol as an American, those would be the same word. But if I accidentally pronounced it with the palatal version, ugol, not ugol or ugol, but ugal, ugal is now a completely different word. No one would ever think it's a pronunciation of the word for corner. It's something else. And in fact, it's this word ugal, which means coal. And if I say ugol or ugol, it wouldn't mean coal. It would mean corner. No one would ever think it's the same. So the difference between la and la is not very significant, but the difference between either of these two and ya is a very significant difference. It's significant enough to make a whole new word. So for a Russian brain, la and la are kind of just versions of the same sound, but ya is a completely different sound. And it's kind of lucky that they end up writing this a little bit differently. You notice in English, we write the two versions the same because it doesn't really matter. Same in German. The Russian word lot, if I said it as lot, which would probably be what I would do if I was an American, had an American accent in Russian, it would be the same thing. People would think lot, lot, it doesn't change the meaning of the word. But if I accidentally mispronounced it as lot, now this is a brand new word. Lot means flight, lot means lead. So if I said lyot, and you can see weirdly in Russian, they don't mark the difference on the consonant. They mark the difference on the following vowel in terms of their writing system. If I was trying to say lyot, but if I said lot or lot, it would mean lead. People would be very confused. Why am I talking about lead instead of talking about flight? So a Russian speaker growing up needs to learn in a very important way the difference between ya and then in another category would be the la or la sound. And this la sound would almost never be used. La would be the one that you would hear most often. So these are two totally different sounds for them. They would change the meaning of the word. Similarly, in Albanian, the word lak, if I pronounced it as lak, that's okay. It's going to be the same word, just maybe a funny pronunciation of it or an unexpected pronunciation, lak, yak. But if I accidentally said lak, like if I was a Russian speaker trying to learn Albanian and I used my Russian accent pattern and said lak, lak is actually a totally different word, which they write with two L's in Lithuanian or in Albanian. Lak. And if I was trying to say lak and I was like, oh, there's L's, it must be lak, lak. Or if I said lak, they would think I'm saying the same word. Lak means loop, lak means spray. And so if I said lak, hoping to say spray, people would hear me as if I was saying loop, not saying spray. Same thing again, mal. Mal is Albanian for mountain, but if I said it as mal, it would be the same word. People would hear me saying the word mountain. But if I accidentally said mal, like if I was a Russian speaker learning Albanian and I'm used to putting this la at there, or maybe even an English speaker where I'm used to the velarized L at the end of a word, I said mal, mal. Instead of mal, I said mal. Then Albanians would mishear me. They would think I was saying this word, written with two L's in their language, mal. And mal means goods or trading goods. So if you said mal or mal when you wanted to say mal, it would confuse people. They would think that I'm saying mountain instead of saying goods, which is what I was hoping to say. So you can see that for Russian and Albanian, there's kinds of confusions among these L which are possible, which aren't true for English and German. Even though English and German have maybe a slightly different pattern about which of these versions they prefer, which of these three L's, they're basically all versions of the same sound. They would never change the meaning of the word if you switched out one for the other. Whereas for Russian and Albanian, there's some different patterns here where the meaning of the word would change if you pronounced one instead of the other. And so this is what we think of as phonemes, which is a matter of perspective. From the etic perspective, from the objective, scientific, outsider's etic perspective, all three of these lateral sounds are objectively different noises. And it wouldn't matter whether an American, a German, Russian, or Albanian made those noises, the microphone, the robot would tell us those three are different sounds. But from the insider's perspective, inside of the brain of these speakers, they wouldn't think of these sounds as being different or being meaningfully different. Or the relationship of which sounds were different and which sounds were the same would really change based on which language I speak and the perspective that I have. For German and English speakers, all three of these sounds, which we could call phones, all three of those phones belong to the same abstract sound category, this sort of like L family. And so that would be a single phoneme. There's a single phoneme, and the sound L, the sound L, and the sound L all belong to that phoneme. For Russians, two of these sounds, or two of these phones, belong to one abstract sound category. In this case, the L and the L belong to one category. I can swap out one for another and it would never change the meaning of the word. But then this other phone belongs to a totally different sound category. This Y is its own thing. And if I swapped out Y for L or Y for L, it would change the meaning of the word. It's a totally different replacement. It would be like swapping out an L for an R in English. In Albanian, two of these sounds belong to one abstract sound category. For Albanian, it's the L and the L, which belong to the same sound category. And the other sound, which belongs to a totally different abstract sound category, is the L, the velarized one. And if I swapped out L for L, I would always get a new word. Or if I swapped out L for L, I would always get a new word. But if I swapped out L for L, because they're in the same category, it wouldn't change the meaning of the word. It would be just a different pronunciation of the same word. So we can visualize it this way. For English, German, Russian, and Albanian, for English, most of the time we hear a L, but at the end of a syllable in English we'll hear L. An English speaker would probably never use this version, maybe before the vowel E or I. But if they did hear it, all three of these are heard as if they're just different variants of the same fundamental sound category. They're different members of the same group. For German, you would almost never hear either the L sound or the L sound. Germans would almost always say this alveolar one, L. But if I swapped out this for this for this for some reason, maybe because of my accent, it wouldn't cause a problem because all three of these sounds belong to the same abstract sound category. So what I can say is that etically, there's three distinct sounds in English or in German, but emically, phonemically, they all belong to a single sound category. So this would be a phoneme, and these are different phones inside of it which belong to it. This would be a phoneme. These are different phones which are inside of it. For Russians, remember, I can switch out L and L. Russians would almost always say L. It would be very rare that a L would ever come out of a Russian's mouth. But if someone did, if I was an American speaking Russian and I accidentally did that, they would hear it as being a version of the same thing. Whereas a L, which Russians would say a lot, is going to be something totally different. Remember, for Albanian, it was the other way around. They say L a lot, but if I accidentally switched out a L for it, these would be the same, but L would be totally different. So in both Russian and Albanian, these three sounds, these three phones, are divided up into two different sound categories, two different phonemes, although the division is a little bit different. So there's three distinct sounds still. Etically, there's three distinct sounds. Phonetically, phonetics. This is why they all have a different symbol in the IPA. Remember, these square brackets are representing actual sounds, actual phones are represented in the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. But in these languages, these three sounds are divided into two sound categories, two different emic categories, two phonemes. So English has one L phoneme, German has one L phoneme, but Russian has two different L-like phonemes, and Albanian also has two different L-like phonemes with which to sort. And so you would hope maybe the Russians would have two different L-like letters to indicate that there's two different phonemes. And we saw that Albanian they write this phoneme with a single letter L, this phoneme with a double letter L. So your brain doesn't actually hear what your ear heard. Your ear hears things etically. It actually just gets the sound waves which come to the hairs on your ear. But your brain, remember, changes that. So if two sounds which are objectively different from each other, scientifically different from each other, ethically different from each other, if they belong to a single category in my brain, though, a single phoneme, then these two sounds will never be used to make a meaningful difference from each other. They could never distinguish one word from another. So in English, la and ra do make a meaningful difference. If I switch out la and ra, I get a brand new word. Low means low, the opposite of high. If I switch out this la for a ra, I get the word row, like row your boat. In Korean, however, if I say lo or ro, it actually would both mean road. There's no way that lo could mean something different from ro, because these, although they're scientifically different, they're ethically different sounds, phonetically different, they belong to the same phoneme in a Korean's mind. One of the ways I know that is because I can switch lo for ro. I can pronounce lo as ro or ro as lo, and it doesn't matter. They'll both mean road. It would never change the meaning of the word if I switched it. In fact, native speakers have great trouble even hearing the difference between sounds within the same abstract category. Part of this is because your brain learned that it was not necessary to hear the difference. If two sounds are never meaningfully different, if the difference between two sounds is never important to distinguish, was it this word or that word? Did the word mean X or did the word mean Y? Your brain is like, that's extra information. I don't have time for that. I don't have energy to pay attention to that. So your brain actually erases that information, erases that detail from the signal given by the ear. And in fact, you literally stop being able to hear the signals that your ear is sending because your brain has gotten so good at filtering out the noise. So for a Korean speaker, the difference between la and ra, it's never a meaningful contrast. So the brain has actually stopped being able to hear the difference between la and ra. It's just extra noise. It's not important. They've lost that ability. I talked about my first day of Russian class when my professor said her name was Lyuba with a palatalized L, and we all responded back, oh, your name is Luba with the alveolar L. To her, that was crazy because she can hear inside of a Russian brain in her emic perspective, la, the palatalized one, la, the alveolar one, sound so different from each other. But emically, me, in my American brain, I couldn't hear the difference. I literally couldn't even hear the difference between Luba, which was her name, and Luba, which meant woodblock. Totally different. La, 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 la. They're very different sounds, but I had to learn that. I had to override this pattern my brain had gotten in of always filtering out that information and force my brain to pay attention to information which I had thought ever since I was 6 months old was totally useless information. Writing systems are also related to this issue that we're talking about. Orthographies tend to, or orthographies at least should, have one symbol for each phoneme, not one for each phone. You've probably noticed that the IPA has way more letters in it than any of the different alphabets that are used by the world's language. That's because world's languages don't need to distinguish every single possible difference in sounds that might be made. They just need to distinguish between the important differences. So for example, we saw with English there's only one letter L, and that letter L is used or could be pronounced in many different ways. It could be pronounced as la or la, maybe in Lee, like the name Lee. I might kind of pronounce that as the palatalized one. The letter L actually represents this sound L in these brackets, the actually alveolar lateral proximant, but the phoneme L, which is a group of sounds which basically includes any version of any lateral proximant, no matter where it is in the mouth or what I've done to it. So the letter actually represents the phoneme, the abstract mental sound category, not the sound itself. Korean has only one letter, this letter which they call ryu, which is used to represent la or la or ra or ra. And this letter represents not the single sound although that might be the most common pronunciation of it, but it can represent any of these other sounds as well. What this letter ryu represents is this abstract sound category, this phoneme. And phonemes I can't pronounce. I can't call this the phoneme L because if I try to pronounce it, then I'm making it into a sound. So if I see these diagonal brackets, I'm talking about a mental sound category. I'm talking about an abstract idea. It has no pronunciation. So I have to say something like the phoneme written with the IPA symbol for R, or something like that. It's not actually, phonemes never have a pronunciation. Phonemes themselves are just an abstract category or a group of sounds with no pronunciation. In Serbian, la and ya belong to separate phonemes. Remember, switching out one of these for the other would create a whole new word. Luba or ljuba, lak, ljak, kal, kal. These would be totally different words in Serbian, just as in Russian and most Slavic languages. So they have one letter, the letter lja, which represents this phoneme, which often gets pronounced as lia, and they have a different letter, la, which represents the phoneme which often gets pronounced as la. So they have two different symbols because they're two different phonemes, where English and Korean have only a single symbol, which represents sounds which are objectively different, but they belong to the same phoneme, the same category. A perfect writing system would have the same number of letters as it does of phonemes. There would be one symbol for each phoneme. Only the IPA actually needs one symbol for each phone. It's the only writing system with one symbol for each phone because the IPA uniquely is an etic writing system. It's trying to capture every possible or actual difference in a system. It's not trying to capture the emic differences or the insider differences that speakers of one language have grown up paying attention to. But remember this, any other writing system for any other language you learn or teach is going to be designed for insiders, people who perfectly speak the language. Writing systems are not designed for outsiders. So outsiders might notice contrasts that the writing system doesn't make, and the outsiders may have a hard time distinguishing between two sounds which the writing system writes separately. Remember, they're bringing the phonemes, the abstract categories from their first language to the new language, and the writing system, the phonemic analysis will be different in the new language than in their old one. So, just as an aside, how many letters would the perfect English alphabet need? Well, we can do this by what we would call a minimal pair. The word bathe is different from the word beige. Swapping out the and je will change the meaning of the word. Bathe is not just a funny pronunciation of beige. Beige is not a funny pronunciation of bathe. So I know that these sounds belong to separate phonemes. The is in one phoneme, je is in another phoneme. So I would need to write these sounds with two different letters. I would perfectly want a writing system that would have one letter for the sounds and one letter for je sounds. Bad and pad. Bad and pad. Again, these would be two totally different words. If I mispronounced bad as pad or pad as bad, it would create a brand new word. It wouldn't be just an accent or a funny way of pronouncing it. It would be a totally different word. So I would need two different letters for the first sounds in this. Remember, we actually said that this thing that we write with the letter B is actually a voiceless sound, and this is a voiceless aspirated one with the little H. But it doesn't really matter phonemically, because remember, phonemically, I'm not trying to represent how it actually gets pronounced. I'm just trying to talk about the abstract category. So we might write this word with a symbol for the letter B, this one for a symbol for the letter P. Bear and beer, the vowels are different. If I said bear as beer, if I switched it, it's not just a funny pronunciation of bear, it's a totally different word. So I need two different symbols for those two different sounds. Leisure and ledger. This is proof that I need two different symbols to distinguish ja and ja, ja and ja. So the perfect English alphabet would have one letter for each phoneme, each one of these mental sound categories into which all of the thousands of possible sounds that someone might ever hear get sorted. We can't possibly have all thousands of sound categories or thousands of letters to represent every variant, but we would need just enough letters to have one letter for each of our sound categories. So there would be 24 consonants in English. This consonant for the B family, the P family, M family, W, F, V, Th, The, T, D, S, Z, N, L, R, Sh, J, Ch, J, Y, K, G, Ng, H. And then these ones, Ts and Z, in English, they could be derived the way that we pronounce them. T could come from actually a T plus a S, Z from a D plus a Z. So we may not need separate letters for these. That would be sort of a debatable. Some people might want to have a separate letter. Some people wouldn't. We would need 11 letters for all of our monophthong phonemes in English. I, I, E, A, O, U. So we would need one letter for each of these. Remember though, if you're from the west of the United States, you actually wouldn't need a separate letter for A and Ah, because you could never change the meaning of the word by swapping out one for another. Don, dawn, cot, caught, hawk the family jewels. I had a hawk that attacked a rabbit. I make a distinction between these two vowels, but a Westerner wouldn't. So because there's never a confusion, there's never any reason for this sound to create a new word from this one, a perfect alphabet for a Westerner would only have a single letter. So a perfect alphabet would be different for each speaker because different speakers sometimes will have different contrasts that are meaningful or not meaningful for them. Likewise, the letter W, so which is the fastest? I would only need one, but there might be someone in Appalachia who needs this upside down W because they would say which is the fastest. And if they switched "wa" for "hua," it would totally change the meaning of the word. Which would become which would become which. And so they would need two different letters where I would only need one. So the actual amount of letters would differ from dialect to dialect, depending on how many sound contrasts are meaningful. We would need 3 diphthong letters, I, ow, oi. Maybe a letter for that unstressed schwa, which is what other things become. So at minimum, I would need 38 letters. But unfortunately, this English alphabet that we have, our version of the Latin alphabet, only gives us 26 to work with. So you can already see that this language is at a serious disadvantage. We need at minimum 12 more letters than what we have to try to represent the meaningful sounds, the phonemes within our language, these sound categories that would be different. If I swapped out any one of these sounds for any other one, it wouldn't be just a weird pronunciation of the same word. It would be a totally different word. If I swapped out for oo, hook, and hook, it's not just a weird pronunciation of the same word, it's a different possible word in the English language.